Not all watercolors are created equal. Some are smooth and transparent, perfect for flower petals and soft bird feathers, while others, called granulating, are gritty, wild, and full of texture, adding instant depth and drama to your painting. Understanding the difference between these two types of watercolor pigments and how to use them together can truly elevate your work, especially when you combine them in a single composition to highlight their contrasting effects. In this video, I will break down what makes granulating pigments so magical, show you several types that behave in completely different ways, and share my favorite methods of using them in a larger painting featuring one of my favorite birds and some lush tropical foliage. As always, the black and white outline will be available on my Patreon channel along with the real-time recording of this demo. Now let's get our paints and start with the basics first. You can think of watercolor pigments as existing on a scale from non-granulating to super-granulating. Non-granulating pigments are smooth and easy to work with. For example, this phthalo blue is fluid, predictable, and perfect for flat washes or layering. Think of a soft morning sky without any clouds. Granulating pigments, on the other hand, contain heavier pigment particles. This ultramarine blue is a classic example. It's in almost every beginner set. Notice that as the watercolor dries, the heavier particles settle into the paper, creating that signature speckled texture. To use the same example of the sky, it would be perfect for skies with soft, natural clouds and some variation in lights and darks. Super-granulating pigments go even further. They produce dramatic, intense textures that can mimic stone, mist, or very stormy weather. They're more niche, but absolutely stunning when used purposefully. Some of the best known super-granulating lines are Daniel Smith Primatech series. These are made with ground minerals and semi-precious stones, so the pigments are naturally heavy and granulate beautifully. Another one is Schmincke super-granulating pigments. These are blends of regular pigments, like my favorite Tundra Violet here. And when they combine two or more pigments, they separate and disperse in water at different speeds, creating stunning color shifts and granulation. To enhance this texture even further, try dropping clean water onto a damp wash. And if you're not sure whether a pigment is granulating, simply look for letter G on the tube or the swatch guide. It stands for granulating. As you can see, we have 3 colors all within the blue side of the spectrum, completely different results depending on the level of granulation. Now let's go deeper into how to actually use granulating pigments in your work before we jump into the final composition. Let's look at 3 similar colors from Schmincke's super-granulating series: Forest Olive, Forest Green, and Forest Brown. A huge thank you to my friend Brian from Blue Pumpkin Seeds for sharing these samples. If you're into gardening, definitely check out their page. It's not sponsored, I just love their products, especially tea. So here are 3 fun ways I use granulating pigments in my work. First, straight from the tube onto dry paper. There's no water prep, just paint directly onto your sheet. This gives you quite dense texture, but not a lot of light to dark variation. The second way is wet on wet technique with pre-wetted paper. So I start with clear water and drop pigment into the wet surface just on one side and watch how it flows and separates. Tilting your paper while your surface is still wet can help gravity do the work for you and intensify the effect. The third is my favorite, water drop bloom effect. After laying down the pigment, you can add clean drops of water, and with super granulating colors like this forest brown, it creates unpredictable blooms and very exaggerated texture, perfect for natural subjects. You can also mix granulating pigments into smoother ones for more subtle texture. That's a little bit easier to control, and this way you will generate more color variation. I use this trick a lot for balance. And if you want a quick beginner-friendly effect, this blooming technique is one of the easiest ways to add interest without layering. Very quick, very beautiful results. I have an entire red rose tutorial dedicated to this on my channel. I will leave a link in the description below. Alright, now let's take everything we've learned so far and move into the full painting. As you can see, I created a fairly detailed composition with overlapping orchids and a little finch bird. For all these elements, I used non-granulating pigments because I wanted the flexibility to build up color gradually through slow, layered application. This part, the flowers and the bird, took me many hours. In contrast, the leaves surrounding the bird were painted using granulating pigments, and that section took only about 25 minutes. I used just one layer of color with some soft shadows added towards the end, and it's more than enough to create texture and visual interest. This is the magic of granulating watercolors. They don't require much work to create beautiful atmospheric effects, and you can use them strategically to enhance your composition and make it feel more dynamic and unique. I want to quickly walk you through how I painted the orchids. A huge thank you to Joanna for sharing her stunning reference photos. She sent me so many different ones, all taken from different angles, which allowed me to arrange them naturally around the bird. Be sure to check out her page. She's an incredible watercolor artist. Now, for these flowers, I used Dioxazine Purple, Quinacridone Magenta, and Quinacridone Violet, all transparent, non-granulating pigments. When I lay down brush strokes with these colors, I get smooth, even coverage. As the petals dry, I'm able to add more saturated details, like the darker veins, without any textural interference. If you had used granulating pigments here, the results would have looked quite noisy and maybe even unfocused, which isn't what I wanted for this part of the painting. The same goes for the bird. I chose non-granulating pigments to help define each color segment clearly. Granulation would have added unnecessary visual texture here that might distract from the detail I was trying to achieve. What I wanted to highlight is another important reason why granulating pigments aren't really used for bright, vibrant subjects. They are mostly earth-based pigments and come from the muted side of the color wheel, mainly browns, darker greens, and blues. Remember how we talked about granulation and the way it occurs when pigment particles are large, heavy, and irregular? Typically, these come from mineral or natural sources. These types of particles don't dissolve completely in water, which is why they settle into paper and create that speckled texture. So earth pigments like ochres, umbers, siennas are made from iron and manganese oxides found in soil and clay. These minerals produce more muted tones like reddish browns, grays, and they don't reflect a broad spectrum of light. They are literally made from dirt, which tends to be, well, not very vibrant. Granulating blues and greens, like cobalt blue or chromium oxide green, also originate from minerals. Naturally, they fall into a softer, more subdued color range. And since these rocks aren't hot pink or bright turquoise, highly granulating pigments tend to avoid those color spaces. You might still wonder, why don't we use granulating vivid reds or pinks? That's because reds like pyrroles and quinacridones, which I use a lot in my work, especially for vibrant flowers, those are synthetic, organic, lab-made pigments. They're incredibly fine and smooth, which makes them high chroma. In other words, they have this intense, saturated look. But because they lack the dense mineral-like structure, they don't granulate. They flow evenly, which is great for vibrant work, like for example, these flower petals, but they're not going to give you a lot of texture. So if you love painting more vibrant and colorful things, you'll want to use these synthetic pigments for the main elements like I'm doing here, and then bring in granulating colors sparingly, the way I'm going to do in a minute on the greenery. So yes, granulating reds do exist, things like Indian red or Venetian red, but these are more muted earth reds. They lean towards brown or violet, not a fire engine red or fluorescent red. And now it's finally time to add granulating pigments to enhance our composition. I'm going to grab two of my favorite granulating greens, Green Apatite Genuine and Cascade Green from Daniel Smith. I will use them to quickly fill in some leafy shapes around the flowers and the bird to frame the overall composition. Now notice that I started by laying down a bright non-granulating yellow, it's called green gold, to create this really vivid undertone, and then I drop in my granulating greens into that wet surface. The result is a soft, natural looking texture that's incredibly effortless. And if you like this particular application, I have so many full tutorials featuring these two granulating colors, including the Sunbird and Lemons, which is on my Patreon. It's about 3.5 hours long. And of course, the Christmas favorite, the Partridge in the Pear Tree. And for deeper, cooler greens in shadowed areas and background foliage, I switched to pure Cascade Green. It's more blue leaning, and as we know, things that are closer to blue on the color spectrum tend to look further away. So it's working out really nicely here for my distant leaves. Whenever I want to amplify the granulation, I add a few drops of clear water while the paint is still damp. It's a simple trick that really pushes the pigment particles around and enhances the texture. What always surprises me is how fast this part goes. It takes less than half an hour to paint all these leaves, and the final results are rich and layered, without me actually doing a lot of glazing at all, the way I did on the rest of the objects in this painting. It's one of the reasons I always recommend granulating pigments for beginners. They give you beautiful effects with very minimal effort. If you want to learn more about different color families and different effects you can achieve, including my favorite granulating colors, I cover these in depth in my new book, 101 Watercolor Secrets. I will leave a link to it in the video description below. And remember, if you want to add depth and create a more realistic finish, you can always go back and gently glaze a layer of non-granulating colors over your granulated washes. What I typically do is reach for something very translucent, like diluted dioxazine purple, to deepen the shadows along the inner edges of the leaves and in those tucked away areas between the flowers, foliage, and the bird. It's a great way to boost contrast and bring more variation to your values, meaning a richer range of lights and darks. I'm also gonna add a final touch of quinacridone magenta inside each orchid to bring in a splash of vibrant color. As you can see, it's this interplay between the heavy texture of granulating pigments and the luminosity of smooth, non-granulating washes that really brings the whole piece together. Now it's time for one of my favorite moments, peeling off the masking tape and adding the final details. I will admit I always have a hard time calling a painting done, and I often find myself adding tiny touches here and there. Sometimes it leads to little accidents like this stray splash of paint on the left. But thankfully, this is where granulating colors come to the rescue. I will simply cover that area with an extra leaf using Cascade Green and move on to a few final glazes. For this step, I'm using aqua green. It's a non-granulating phthalo pigment, similar to the phthalo blue I used in the beginning when I demonstrated those blue egg-shaped swatches. It's perfect color for soft shadowing, smooth, transparent, and super versatile. I use it to gently glaze over textured leaves, yellow feathers, and even some of the purple orchids, tying my palette together. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration. If you like to explore granulating pigments further, be sure to check out the tutorials I've linked here. One features a vibrant red rose using my favorite blooming technique, and another popular one is a blue pumpkin painted with super granulating blue from Schmincke. Both are surprisingly easy and quite beginner friendly. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again soon with more watercolor magic.